A lot to talk about. I was slowing my introduction there because I wasn't sure if we were actually live yet. But indeed, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the war in Iran. The latest, and someone who we have on a regular basis at this point is Eyre. So, Alan, I mean, goodness me, where to start right now? Trump's trying to sort of distract from the deteriorating situation with the war in Iran by buddying up with Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, Iran is threatening Europe. Well, apparently the Financial Times reports so. So I guess let's start there. What do you make of these assessments that Iran is weighing up potential targets across Europe?
I don't know how significant that is, how much that is bluster and how much that is strategic planning. Certainly, it doesn't need to target places in Europe. It can already target the GCC infrastructure, which in terms of its effect on the global economy is far more efficacious than targeting Europe. I don't know what the value add is for targeting European targets, but again, Iran says a lot of stuff just to sound tough, much like the US administration does. The underlying reality is that it's the two clocks issue. We're trying to chokehold Iran's economy, and they're trying to chokehold the global economy and by extension, the US economy by keeping the Strait of Hormuz, if not fully closed, seriously constrained. Other than that, there is obviously a dynamic potential for escalation that never goes away, but that's where we are.
But I want to dig into this a little bit more because I've sort of split the way that I cover the two things now is sort of Ukraine, China is pre-recorded segments and live updates of Iran because of the tumultuality of it, just how sort of one day Trump could be like, oh, we're doing back channel discussions. No, we're not, says Iran. So I just never bother trying to sort of make a pre-recorded event because it'd be out of date. But I want to dig into this a little bit more because we had a conversation with someone in the live stream yesterday, and they were sort of asking what you don't think it's a bigger deal, or maybe it sort of depends how, but isn't it a big deal? Because if the Iranians are really going to be that irrational to attack European targets, that's a risk calculation which serves no strategic benefit, surely.
Well, I don't see it as irrational. I see it as unfortunate. But why is it irrational? What is Europe going to do? Attack Iran? Guess what? Been there, done that, right? They've already been attacked by the United States. Okay, and in fact, attacking Europe, you get the economic dislocation and the pearl clutching by a couple of more states that are closer ideologically aligned to the U.S., perhaps. So yeah, I mean it's escalation. But I don't see why it's irrational.
So let's put a pin in that for a moment, and I'll step back and ask you a broader framing of this, which is what I titled this conversation, which is the general sentiment amongst some analysts is that Iran is shifting from one of a defensive calculus to an offensive one. Do you think that that's the case, that it's willing to take more overt moves to pressure Trump even more, including potential escalation vertically or horizontally?
Yeah, I do. I think that the Iranian new leadership has decided that it doesn't make sense to always react to U.S. aggression. That's what got him into this in the first place, by proportionate responses, if not performative responses. And I think they're trying to reserve the potential to initiate as opposed to respond, because the underlying calculus here is they feel they've got the U.S. on its back foot. They want to keep the U.S. that way. One of the most significant events of the last week or so has been the collective Iranian decision to keep the strait closed almost regardless, because it doesn't want to give President Trump's administration a surcease, a pause in the pressure on it. So, yeah, I think that's where we are right now. I think they're thinking about, they want to inject an element of strategic uncertainty into the equation. It's a high risk strategy, but, and in a sense, it's more desperation than hubris. All these people talk about, the emboldened Iranian leadership. They're not emboldened. They're just, I think, trying to rustle up as much strategic deterrence as they can in the face of goodness gracious, the overwhelming military power and world animosity that's aligned against them. They don't really have that any really strategic allies. Sure, Russia's going to help them to an extent. China's going to help them to an extent. But look who's arrayed against them. So I think they're making the best they can of a bad hand.
Certainly. And so that leads to the point that I'll unpin now, which is, isn't it therefore, based on what you've just said, a little bit irrational or illogical, perhaps, to directly antagonize an entire continent that has up until this point be like, hey guys, as in Trump, we don't want anything to do with this. Striking American bases in Gulf states or sovereign nations within the Middle East is one thing. It keeps the conflict relatively contained to the Middle East, which is why when people go, oh, World War III, it's always bollocks in the case of the Middle East, at least. Well, I think it is, and I think it largely is. But if you're going to start directly targeting military bases or installations dotted around Europe, that's the sovereign base of those nations, not Americans. So that is a direct threat, and therefore would activate NATO to a large extent, surely. Or you think that you really think the Europeans are just going to be like, oh, we've had some missile strikes on some bases in Ramstein, that's fine.
Again, first of all, I don't necessarily assume that this is a realistic possibility from Iran. But even if it were, what's the marginal threat? It's not like these are independent into different countries. They're all sanctioning Iran anyway. You know, France has said that they want to participate in the convoy to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. So what's the downside if Iran were to strike a European base? And obviously, I'm not saying it should, I think it'd be horrible. But from Iran's point of view, you know what? Are you worried about France bombing Iran? Are you worried about, land troops from Germany? I don't, they already have European enmity. I think if they assume that Europe is not going to mount an armed force that could cause them significant incremental damage to the massive sucking chest wound that the US and Israel have already inflicted on them, to my mind, the question is, what's the upside? What do you get by bombing Europe that you don't get by bombing Gulf infrastructure? In one way, it's better because Iran is going to need and can possibly calculate on some type of mediated Gulf not alliance, but modus vivendi in the foreseeable future, because the Gulf countries have to live with Iran. So if you want to escalate and you forego attacking GCC countries and instead attack European countries, which will, as you correctly assess, freak out global markets and have probably a substantial financial impact, you get much of the upside and almost none of the downside.
So you're but okay.
I'm just pushing back against your contention that threatening to bomb targets in Europe is irrational. I don't necessarily assume that. I don't, again, because I think that Iranian strategic leadership up until now, bounded rationality. Given your goal is survival, how do you want to get to that? I think they're, got instrumentally rational in terms of how they seek to achieve their ongoing survival as a regime.
But there's two. Oh, my fingers are not there. There's two. You can't see my fingers. There's two different elements there, which I think, on the one hand, we're in agreement in the sense that it's within. Let me just turn down my. Let me turn down my blur. There's two different elements there. It makes more sense. I think this is where we're in agreement that Iran focuses on the GCC countries, on its near abroad, and those states within the Middle East. Where I'm still, if I take your point, then I understand your point. You're saying that in the longer term, if the Iranians can leverage enough strikes on Europe or disruption that on the markets there, that will have a trickle down effect on the United States and the global economy indirectly. Is that the bottom line?
Iran is not happy with the status quo. It's attritional. They want the blockade on their ports lifted. They want to be able to sell their oil. They want,
summer. And
how do they get that? They get that by threatening to escalate. Against who? Well, they can't reach the U.S., and things like $30,000 per dead or imprisoned U.S. soldier, whatever. I don't, that's, I think, largely bluster. But in terms of if they look at their tray of strategic options and say, retaliate against GCC economic and energy infrastructure, or retaliate against U.S. bases or other targets within Europe. All I'm saying is right now, me sitting talk with you, I don't see if one of those two options is off the table for the Iranian IRGC leadership at this point.
They're probably not. I just wonder that's quite a gambit, right? To always reference the show. That's quite a gambit in the several moves ahead you have to think about. So by strike,
that's not several moves ahead. That's one move ahead. If
it's on the presumption that it's going to cause enough disruption in Europe that the markets go that volatile. That's not something the Iranians can guarantee. Meanwhile, they're reorientating their attention away from perhaps other targets, which would have greater yield, greater impact.
Well, again, you could talk about which target has marginal utility in terms of disrupting global markets, GCC ones or European ones. Again, that's a detailed conversation. You can also talk about missile, reach and CEP, circular error probable, in terms of how, if you're going against a specific point, that's a legitimate discussion that perhaps is being talked, being undergone right now in Iran among the people running the country, the IRGC.
Sure.
But again, the key point is Iran, in addition to maintaining its chokehold on the strait and using its military to keep attacking ships trying to, run through the Omani waters, has to preserve in its mind escalation options. And those are two large buckets of escalation options. Obviously, each has downside. So the question is, what's the downside versus the upside?
Yeah, the cost-benefit analysis. And as I say, to me, I'm still your point about the disruption it causes for the markets is certainly one, but it's for me based on quite a lot of things falling into place quite smoothly and in the right way. That can we guarantee that would happen? That being said, yes. What would the Europeans do? I do think that if you saw, I don't know, let's take a hypothetical. I used Bulgaria as an example yesterday in this conversation because they have a couple of bases. It's not too far for Iran. They're not that as well defended probably by NATO, interception and so on. What realistically would that mean? Would the British and French start acting on behalf of Bulgaria because of NATO? Probably not. But if the Iranians target Britain, if they targeted the NATO Southern Command in Naples, that would be a significant shift, which I don't think NATO would just ignore. I think there are there's a level of severity in terms of the targets.
Right. In terms of vertical escalation, attacking a GCC country is not vertical escalation. Attacking a NATO country is. So you're right. The stakes become higher if Iran attacks a NATO country, certainly Great Britain or France, right, or Germany, than if it just lobs some more missile at the UAE or Kuwait or, or even the kingdom. But yeah, I'll certainly see that point.
Okay, fair. Yes, I outsmarted the great Alan.
That's not hard. That's a low bar, believe me.
No, really it's nice to have conversations with you. No, it's good to spar with you, I think, on these points. But I think another element here, which is quite interesting then, and again, maybe you will say that it's a bit overhyped or there's not as much to it. How much is there, do we have to take into consideration the variance of opinions within the Iranian machine? So the ultra-nationalists versus the moderates, if they're still distinguishable enough, Ghalib Buff, how much are his comments something that should be taken into consideration when we're looking about what Iran wants to do in this period right now?
They should be ignored. Politics happens in Iran, unlike the United States, where essentially it's one person's opinion that's driving the whole policy. I would say that Iran has certainly more decision streams leading into the mix that results in a final decision. And in terms of effective political spectrum, you've got in Iran moderate conservatives, hardline conservatives. The hardliners, are a lot of the IRGC leadership. Some of the IRGC is moderate. You have a few civilian leaders who matter, like Ghalibaf, who is probably closer to the moderate conservative, but still, he's in step with the IRGC. So I don't think the difference of opinion in Iran is in any way, as the US administration has been claiming, paralyzing or even significantly slowing down the decision cycle inside Iran. Certainly the fact that Mojtaba is either, suboptimal in health or squirreled away such that getting communications with him takes time, that, is another wrinkle. But there again, I don't think that Mojtaba is really involved in day-to-day strategy, right? So at this point. So I think it's more that they look to him for, the stamp of approval on decisions that are collectively made at the Supreme National Security Council level. So yeah, there are politics inside Iran. That's the sign of a normal government. There are politics inside every country, but it's not paralyzing. And it's so far, considering the fact that huge swaths of the Iranian leadership has been killed, since February, they seem to be handling it relatively well.
Okay, that's fair. So one other thing that I saw that was quite interesting was about, Aragachi has been quite entertaining on Twitter. He is quite good at provoking Trump, I think, and he's largely dismissed this new set of sanctions, well, the sanctions campaign, as a diversion from domestic American issues. So-called economic D-Day. What's your take on all that? Is that just war of words, psychological warfare, trying to wind Trump up and just make him misstep as usual? Or is there anything to this sanctions package?
I just think that's the ambient heat being thrown off by the machinery of governance. This is what MFAs do. Trump says something, characterize it however you will, and Arakchi will respond on social media. It's not moving the dial at all. Yeah, it's clear that, with their little Lego videos and the fact that they're tracking Iranian markets and, know about the yield on a 30-year bond and our $40 trillion of debt. It's, they're quite aware of the pressures and tensions that are focusing on President Trump as he decides what to do next. And they're certainly picking at it. Is it decisive? No, I don't think President Trump needs Foreign Minister Arakchi to tell him that there's a huge inflation spike heading our way as President Trump's party heads into midterms. He doesn't need the Arakchi or Ghalibaf to point out that the fundamentals of the U.S. economy are weakening, as evidenced by $40 trillion debt, bond yields and other facts. So, but yeah, you're right. It is a goading, and again, both sides seem to either like doing that or feel it's necessary.
Okay, interesting. So,
but it's funny because again, when we were doing this in the Obama era, we didn't do that. Both sides had serious strategic messaging discipline. And again, there's a lot of differences between Obama era and now, but one of which was both sides were working toward a common goal, which was a negotiated solution to the nuclear issue. And so we didn't fight each other or push back against each other through the media. We tracked what each other said, and if we substantially disagreed with it, we would deal with it. But there wasn't, we weren't waging war through mass media, which is what was happening now.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to get a little bit more of your perspective on, because we've never had a conflict of this type ever, right? This is the day that so many Iranians have been preparing for, thinking about, and finally it happened this year. But during the Obama administration, your time, you would have moments of flare-ups, right? There were flashpoints. How did you navigate those periods when you were trying to undertake these long, drawn-out diplomatic negotiations, when on the other hand you had military activity, you had kinetic, I don't want to say warfare is too strong, but like kinetic engagement, right?
Oh, we weren't engaging kinetic. We weren't, attacking Iran back then. The huge difference is back then, Obama hadn't attacked Iran twice during negotiations within 2 years. The second main difference is we were talking with Iranians. The Obama administration believed in the potential of diplomacy. They believed that even though diplomacy doesn't solve everything, you can't solve anything without it. This current Trump administration doesn't believe in diplomacy, doesn't know how to do diplomacy. All it knows how to do is issue these diktats in capital letters, hoping for the other side to capitulate. So that's the difference. If we had a beef with Iran back in the Obama administration, we talked to them about it. We didn't, go on social truth media, Truth Social, in capital letters and, try to terrify them with threats.
Yeah, but I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. So you had Stuxnet in 2009. Now,
Yeah.
of course, before the JCPOA negotiations began, you had sanctions escalated during 2010 and 12. But the one example I'm thinking of, which came up during some reading I was doing, was in January of 2016. You had about 10 US sailors that were detained by the IRGC after drifting into Iranian waters. So like you guys were still doing negotiations, but there was still that emphasis on diplomacy, but you had these moments where there was a real concern about some kind of escalation in between the two actors simultaneously. Did that not have implications?
Yeah, but we communicated with them. Those sailors were not held for 444 days. They were, as I recall, released relatively quickly, right? So, yeah, no one is saying that, the JCPOA was a kumbaya moment after which, Iran and us, we were on the same sheet of music and were able to work out our differences diplomatically. No, we were able to, on a specific issue, after 5 years of effort and 158 pages, not including annexes, come up with a solution to the nuclear issue that satisficed, that was good enough, right? But, that was hard work. Serious, sustained diplomacy with an implacable enemy like Iran is hard work. This administration doesn't want to do that hard work. So it just keeps looking for shortcuts. Hasn't found it yet, unlikely to find one, which is why we're in the strategic quagmire we're in now.
Sure. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces. Everyone, if you're enjoying the stream, then of course do give it a like and a share, a subscribe if you're new. But Alan, I guess what's interesting to me just a little bit on this is that the sentiment amongst the hawks, the neocons, if you like, is that Iran can't be and should never have been trusted, and that even though I'm more inclined to agree with you, just to be devil's advocate, that their argument is that even whilst you were attempting these negotiations, Iran was acting in bad faith, that behind the scenes there were clandestine operations, cyber interference, etc., etc. Do you just call BS to all of that then? And the Iranians were genuine?
It's not a question of trust. To paraphrase Reagan, it's not a case of trust but verify. It's a question of don't trust and verify. And so we came to a negotiated agreement on the JCPOA. Every 6 months afterward, we had to certify that they were obeying that. And we did. Obama did, and Trump did. When President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, it wasn't because he could prove or even that he claimed that the Iranians were not fulfilling the JCPOA. He did it because he just wanted a better deal. So, yeah, I'm not sitting here going, we don't understand the Iranians. We should trust them. Ridiculous. We shouldn't trust them. We should have a verification regime that works for any agreement that we come up with the Iranians. Okay? But the point is, you don't negotiate stuff with your friends. You do it with your allies. Dick Cheney said, we don't negotiate with evil. Evil is the only thing you should negotiate with. You don't need to negotiate with good, right? So people who say you can't trust the Iranians, that's like the theory of ether wins. It just doesn't exist. It's not a question of trust. It's a question of verification.
But can you really make those two things the same level of legitimacy, though? You know, verification is something that is dependent on a bit of trust, isn't it?
No. Again, if you have the IAEA doing intrusive unannounced inspections, if you have cameras on site, you've got, you know, U.S. Western Mossad intelligence. Of course, you really can't trust Israeli intelligence in terms of what they tell U.S. intelligence. You know, that's a sufficient level of verification. You can never prove a negative. I cannot prove to you right now that Iran wasn't building a thermonuclear weapon in 2017 while the JCPOA was in effect, right? But again, to use this word, you can have verification that satisfies, that's good enough, okay? So the level of verification is an important question. You know, for example, Iran says, well, we have a fatwa, an Islamic ruling by, you know, Ayatollah Khamenei, and perhaps this new one will do it, that weapons of mass destruction are un-Islamic, so we'll never use them. Obviously, that doesn't cut it, okay? But all of this is under the umbrella of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is a signatory. As a signatory, there are certain things they have to do as prescribed by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to, you know, be a member in good faith, right? The IAEA has a good feel for what's necessary, right? So, you know, if the IAEA issues a report saying Iran is not in compliance, which they've done at least twice in recent memory, that's important. It goes to the UN Security Council. If the IAEA says, yeah, I'm feeling warm and fuzzy at this point about what Iran is doing, that's also significant.
Well, I mean, I'd love to believe it was significant, but a lot of people just think the UN has no relevance whatsoever anymore.
Well, now, the Trump administration, it doesn't. But again, I'm talking about a normally functioning U.S. administration within a world that still has gossamer-thin ties to what's called international law. Obviously, the U.S. administration now has shredded international law. It's acting unilaterally. It's trying to disband the International Criminal Court. It's attacked countries, I don't know how many times, 8 times unilaterally in contravention of international law. So this U.S. administration is a one-off. Let's hope it's not a precursor to the future administrations.
Well, if they've done so much damage to it, what's the point in trying to talk about or imagine a world where the United States is adherent to international law? Is it really going to return to that? I don't think the US is ever going to be quite back to where it was prior, because it's unclear exactly what person of a more conventional mindset and values is set to take up the mantle, right? Marco Rubio, Gavin Newsom, those seem
Swedish singer called Jens Lekman, right? Really good singer. He's got a great lyric. He says, what's broken can always be fixed, but what's fixed is always broken. So, yeah, you're right. We have broken something that, you know, post-World War II had incrementally, organically grown into, you know, a certain type of international order. This administration of this president has broken it. Will it remain fully broken? No, it can be fixed. But will everyone remember that in history, one presidency went off the rails and did whatever it wanted to, whenever it wanted to, for whatever reason it wanted to? Yes, that will remain in the historical memory.
Yeah, well, I don't hold much confidence, unfortunately, Alan. But I also wanted to drill a little bit more into the sort of growing concerns of a third round of kinetic warfare.
Yeah.
Counterpart Trita Parsi has made very clear to me that he thinks that this is imminent, that unfortunately a third round, a heightened sense of escalation and conflict, destruction is near upon us. Do you share that sentiment?
I certainly think that there's an underlying dynamic that is inherently escalatory. If in fact the blockade reaches a certain level of pain, Iran will seek to have it lifted, probably by kinetic action. Or if President Trump, as he is wont to do, gets frustrated because he lacks strategic patience and he feels that the blockade isn't working quickly enough, or whether it's the proximate cause is the Strait of Hormuz and Iran attacking ships trying to run through the Omani waters, or the U.S. Navy attacking Iranian ships trying to run the blockade. Yeah, it is quite likely there is an escalatory as opposed to a de-escalatory dynamic that could be like a positive feedback loop. So I share Trita's concerns. I don't know whether it's imminent, but it's certainly likely.
Great. Okay. But what would that mean this time? Is the economic threats and intentions from Trump that we're hearing right now the rumblings of the beginning of something that will be followed by military action?
Again, President Trump has, to a man with a $1 trillion military, everything looks like a problem that could be bombed out of existence. Okay. Does he intellectually understand that military force is not going to get him what he wants? I don't know. Again, part of the problem with the Trump administration is there's this Potemkin village of information in which he lives. No one is giving him hard truths. All of his cabinet secretaries are just, praising him. The information he gets is screened, so it reaffirms that which he believes. So, maybe the world that he perceives as a result of the information flows into him is significantly different than that which the world that you and I have access to through following print media and through following what's going on. Will that skew his decisions? Quite possibly.
Right. Okay. Skew his decisions, everyone. So what do you think happens now then? We haven't seen really much. We had a couple of other experts on, and one of them was like, please don't ask me about Iran. There's nothing to talk about. I don't know if I would go that far, but certainly how many times can you reframe the same sort of shit that these two seem to be doing, right? Defense Ministry of Iran says its weapons have stunned its enemies. Trump says that they're talking about they're doing backdoor diplomacy. No, not. So, how unsettled should we be in the current circumstances, given the past 6 months of everything? Tomorrow is the 6-month anniversary of this war.
I mean, again, they say in Latin, what is it? Natura non facet saltum. Nature does not proceed by leaps. What's changing every day is global economic resiliency is getting less. We're using our strategic petroleum reserves. The price of diesel is getting higher. So there is change. It's slow, organic change. And unfortunately, it's deterioration, right? Again, this is all a function of the complex system that we broke in February 28th. It's got a lot of parts. They're all moving, and it still hasn't found, homeostasis. So you're right. By and large, not much has changed. President Trump says something nonsensical. The Iranians say something threatening. That's this ongoing sort of Brownian motion that really doesn't affect anything, but it's just, it's picked up by news media and, like President Trump's latest tweet about economic D-Day. Well, again, play that out. What does that mean? Are you going to sanction China? Sanction Russia? So you sort of have to dig beneath the social media postings. But the basic contours of this war are, it's an economic war. There's two sets of chokeholds, and both sides can, escalate militarily if they think that will help their relative position. At some point, one side is going to have to cry uncle, right? And move its red lines from where they are now. I think it's more likely the U.S. will do that, unfortunately. What are you frowning? Yeah.
You really think that? Well, okay. You really think Trump's ego is going to give? Or he'll see the results of the midterms and he won't
give. He'll just reconfigure how he perceives things. He's saying the Strait of Hormuz is open. He's saying they'll never have a nuclear weapon. I think this administration tends to reconfigure how it presents reality, so it is the hero. So yeah, President Trump is going to, this administration is likely going to have to accept a position where we are strategically worse off than when we were when we started the war. That is almost 100% unavoidable. Okay, go ahead.
What can Trump do? I think I used this analogy with someone. Well, I used this analogy with another guest, but I can't remember if it was you.
Yeah.
If, let's use the comparative analysis of Putin and Ukraine, in that Putin's facing a significantly unfavorable position. He either has to declare mobilization, which admits that the SMO is not going great, or he has to not declare mobilization, but then the war doesn't go well. So FYI, there's a mic feedback because of what you're doing. So yeah, just be careful. So some people reckon Putin is pushing for the oblasts of Kherson and not Kherson, Luhansk and Donetsk, because that will be enough for him to play safe and say, hey guys, as in Russian public, we've done what we needed to do. We're going to draw down the war. Maybe not completely end it. What's Trump's equivalent? What could he feasibly get away with that's just enough that he thinks he can present it at least to his MAGA base, that they're like, oh yeah, no, that was worth the war of 6 months and economic implications, or not?
He can agree to a deal where the strait is reopened under Iranian control, where Iranian assets are unblocked, but it's like the Gulf countries throwing Iran money that's blocked there, or other countries. So he could say no US money, no pallets of cash have been given to Iran. So again, if you stipulate that whatever he claims doesn't have to correspond to underlying reality, he can say whatever he wants, right? He's done that before about all sorts of issues. He won the last president, what is it, the 2020 election. It was rigged. We all know that's nonsense. It's not even close to being true. It's a palpably false lie. But still, he keeps saying it, right? So why can't you do the same with this war?
Okay, interesting. No, that's the first I've heard about the 2020 election.
Is it 2020 or what's the one? Yeah, the 2020 election.
I'm making you second guess, Ali.
Okay.
I thought Biden I thought Trump stole it off Biden. Or did Biden steal it off? Everyone's stealing off everybody. And
he can say whatever he wants. Look, the people who dislike Trump dislike him. At this point, it's set in stone. The people who support him, set in stone. There are some marginal people he's losing. Actually, that's not true, because he is losing his base as a result of these prices and as a result of this forever war. So we'll see.
All right. So another great 40 so conversation with you, Alan. What do we take away from this one? Where do we focus on in the next days before we reconvene for another sort of Alan era update, an Alan era rant? What do we focus on?
You track the price of diesel, you track the price of gasoline, you track the number of ships going through the Strait of Hormuz, or the number of VLCCs, the oil carrying ships that pass through the strait in either direction. And then you realize that there are far more important issues that no one's talking about, like the ongoing collapse of our climate that's going to cause some serious problems, which I don't need to tell you about, because you're in Europe where the average degree now is hellish, right? So,
well, I'm also climate. I worked on climate issues in Africa for several years, so I'm more than well aware of.
I'm preaching to the choir. Yeah.
But the U.S. sanctions on Iran, quote, will be the toughest in history. Bessent has just warned. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has warned Iran to expect the toughest sanctions, and the U.S. is going to collapse this regime. Oh God, we're back to this language again.
Whatever.
He said this on CNBC. He added that the, quote, maximum economic pressure means likely not a kinetic restart, meaning the US is unlikely to restart military action against Iran. Wow, such tough talk, qualified by such lowly, weak-sounding speech.
Here's the interesting thing, that the U.S. has not realized that threatening additional increments of pain will not move the needle. The only thing that will is additional units of pleasure, of money, right? The stick, the US stick has been used and is broken. It's a US twig, okay? So what can move the dial strategically? That which President Trump cannot give, which is an easing of sanctions, an unblocking of assets, less hostility toward Iran. Okay, that is so far outside the Overton window of US policy, it's outside the Overton house.
We're on a different street.
Exactly. An Overton universe. Anyway.
One of the multiverses. Now, I think it's very entertaining that we're back to using regime collapse rhetoric, but at the same qualifying that this one. Basically, guys, we're back to what we were, not just in 2016, but 2018 after the JCPOA was left. We're back to maximum pressure, economic sanctions, but nothing else. Maybe we'll see. Maybe we'll see kinetic action this time. Oh, that'd be escalation. Oh, wait, this is deja vu. Anyway, everyone, my quips aside, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the conversation, then, of course, do subscribe. Do check out Alan's work, both on Substack and at the Middle East Institute, where he is a senior fellow, distinguished fellow, I should say. And we'll have you, well, we'll see you all very soon. We'll have you back, Alan, next week, as usual, hopefully. And stay tuned, everyone.